Doing photography with your telescope, actually putting the camera in the eyepiece holder, is really the worst case scenario. That's the hardest kind of astrophotography to do. It's the one that's actually going to put most pressure on your technique and also the performance of your mounting and your optical system. An easier way into astrophotography is to get things going with a piggyback mounted camera like this, using relatively short focal length lenses. Certainly initially nothing over 50mm focal length, so go with wide angle lenses, whether you're using a digital SLR or a film SLR. Typically around the 35mm focal length will give you a good start in doing astrophotography with your telescope. But even with the just simple piggyback photography, it's still important to get the mounting of your telescope in the best possible condition so that you get a chance of getting nice tight stars and good guiding. Let's look at it pretty much from the ground up, really. One of the things to have your suspicions of is the tripod. The tripod is often the weak link in almost any telescope system. We've got this tripod set up at maximum extension. Really, for doing photography, that's completely unnecessary. We're going to be a lot better off if we set this tripod much lower down. Straight away, there's a lot more now holding the legs in position, and it's far more sturdy. We've got a lower center of gravity with the whole system, and there's a lot more now actually holding the leg steady. Another good tip as well before you finish setting up the tripod is make sure that the head bolts here holding the tripod legs to the head are as tight as they can be. Don't over tighten them, but certainly make sure there's no play or buckle in the head of the tripod, and actually gently tease the tripod leg out very slightly. I'm just pulling that very slightly out. It's almost as though now the tripod is kind of grabbing the ground. So I'm actually putting the tripod leg under a bit of tension. I'm actually pulling it against the central point here. I'm not doing it very much, it's just enough to get it nice and solid. There are other considerations that you'll need to give thought to about setting up your telescope for astrophotography. Remember, you're probably not going to get great results first night out, so do plan on this being a sustained program of activity, and there it's important to consider setting up the telescope night after night. Make sure you get a good polar alignment. Now, with the telescope as you probably received it from your supplier, it's unlikely that the polar alignment scope, if you have one, is perfectly aligned in its bore. So you'll actually need to set that up. You refer to your instructions that you got with your telescope and actually make sure that the polar alignment scope is properly aligned in the RA axis of your telescope. This is basically done by looking through the polar scope and then moving the mount around 180 degrees and making sure that it's still pointing through the center of the system by looking at either a distant target or typically a star in the night sky. We're focusing our attention here on the worm and gear relationship on the RA drive, and we can actually feel for backlash just by operating the slow motion here, and I can actually feel there's quite a bit of backlash on this mounting that could do with being adjusted out. It's not a difficult thing to do. There's a little rocker box here with 2 screws and a grub screw in the middle of it, and basically by tightening the 2 main screws I can bring the worm into closer contact with the gear. The backlash is caused by there being too much play between the splines on the worm and the splines on the RA gear. There's basically too much slop between those two when they're moving, and that's a problem. We really want to make sure that the worm is more fully embedded in the gear profile to minimize that amount of movement. Now, we don't want it in there too far. We don't want to close the gap up so that there's nothing there at all. We want a reasonable amount of gap there, but not too much. So that rather than that, basically. It's important to get that right. Lubrication is important here as well. Now, if you can't find the right grease or you haven't got that available, you may find there's more than enough grease at the ends of the worm worm gear itself to enable you to re-lubricate the gear system, and you can literally take that off with a wooden spatula and butter it back onto the worm to give it a good chance to develop a coating over the worm, so that again that will help the lubrication of that process. It's worth bearing in mind that you're going to tend to find that seasonally this gap is going to breathe backwards and forwards. You're going to tend to find that it's going to tighten up in summer and it's going to be relaxed slightly in winter. So do be prepared to do this seasonally and any time that it actually needs to be done. We were talking about backlash in the gear, and we've already covered the fact that you've got to have a little bit of gap there, otherwise the system is actually going to seize up. What we want to make sure with the counterbalance weight is that there is no tendency to vacillate. As the motor on your drive system challenges the inertial moment of the telescope head mass, we want to make sure that there is no tendency for it to overrun, that it's actually fully engaged on the gear surfaces and working properly. You know, full engagement between the worm and gear is what we're looking for. Now, putting it very slightly out of balance is the way to do that, to make sure that the splines in the worm are resting and pressing firmly on the splines of the RA gear itself. Making sure everything is fit for purpose and tightened fully, making sure that there's no slack in the tripod, making sure that the RA gear specifically is well engaged, making sure that you've got good polar alignment, making sure that when you set the telescope up, you set it up the same each time. Remember, if you do repetitive steps where everything is repeated and that you can repeat those steps easily, you're more likely to spot problems and you're more likely to be able to accumulate better performance as you go along. So little steps like marking your decking or ground, maybe with a permanent marker, or even putting a tin tack where the top of your tripod goes or something like that. Anything to make sure that every time you set the telescope up, it's as near as possible the same as the last time you used it. So a good regime of actually setting up your telescope. With that, you should be in a slightly better position to attempt some astronomy and take some pictures of the night sky. Good luck.